In the last 18 months, the stability of global supply chains has been put under the sort of stresses rarely seen outside of global conflict. The pandemic would have been enough. However, on the 23rd of March 2021, the Ever Given managed to lodge itself in the Suez Canal due to high winds and a dust storm. Thanks to this small change in weather, the primary trade route between Asia and Europe ground to a halt. After 6 days, upwards of 200 vessels carrying raw materials and manufactured goods waited for the canal to clear, causing delays in deliveries across the world. But amidst the headlines and punchlines, the incident threw into sharp relief exactly how vulnerable global supply chains truly are. All it can take is one bad day for a captain on the other side of the planet to impact businesses here. Welcome to the BPA Portscast. I'm Richard Ballantyne, and joining me today to discuss shipping resilience are Phoebe Warnford-Thompson and Mark Simmons, both of the BPA. So Phoebe, just kicking off, why have we had such a situation in the last 18 months? Just to tell us about the sort of particular impacts as you see it.
So Richard, I think the primary reason is because COVID has had such a different impact on the world at different times. So in 2020, when China opened back up, Europe shut down, yet many ports in the UK had their busiest months ever in May 2020. Goods were arriving in the UK and Europe when there was no longer the demand for these goods because shops were shut, which resulted in warehouses filling up and sub-businesses never even collected their stock from the ports.
Mark, I know you've looked at some of these oddities that have occurred, things like empty containers. So what's been going on there in a very high level?
Well, we've seen empty containers being essentially stuck in the wrong place around the world and not finding their way back to the Far East where they often filled up with trainers and fridges and other stuff and sent back to us. So that's been a huge problem. And I still can't get my head around that. The Port of Los Angeles was exporting 10,000 empty containers every day in October just to try and get rid of them. And I think the market is starting to respond, and we're seeing ships just carrying empty containers or ports starting to offer places just to stack or store your empties. So things are starting to respond, but it still seems like it's going to be a problem for a while yet.
We saw quite a lot of issues with storage, didn't we, and pressures on warehousing and other distribution facilities, etc. So I guess that's set to continue. But what else in the sector's been impacted, Phoebes? Have you you've been keeping an eye on sort of numbers and etc. What are the things to watch at? I mean, what kind of stuff am I not going to be able to get in shops, or are we all fine? Is the sector managing?
I think one thing worth bringing in on the back of the conversation we've just had about the imbalance of containers is actually this was largely driven or exacerbated by the change in consumer behaviour of the last year. So by the end of 2020, trade came roaring back. Consumers were spending less on services and had more disposable income for manufactured goods, be this a new TV or redoing the kitchen because they'd spent less money going out in the year. But ports globally struggled to keep up with the sudden volume of these goods. And another point to add is actually e-commerce was up 15 to 20% last year in the UK. And the changing nature of supply chains means that the journey of goods is not necessarily port, warehouse, shop, where the goods used to be bought by customers. Now it's commonly port, warehouse, home, which the supply chain is slowly adapting to.
Yeah, and I suppose as I found particularly in my household, and I'm sure many others did with the lockdown, we're all staying at home, and just as I ordered too many takeaways, I was also on a lot of platforms like Amazon, etc., ordering things to be delivered home. So that has a particular consequence for the logistics industry, and I think that's obviously set to continue, I would imagine. Mark, I'm not expecting you to comment particularly on the pounds and pence, etc., it costs to get things round from Asia now, but just tell us a little bit about what's happened on shipping costs, if you can.
Well, it'll probably have changed by the time we've edited this and gone up another $1,000 or something. The costs have skyrocketed. We're seeing policymakers in the US and other parts in Asia starting to look at shipping and starting to have a real impact on prices in shops. We're being told.
We've seen shipping costs increase, and it's been sort of over the shipping publications particularly have profiled this, but also there've been some of these importers into the UK who've, you know, the last thing they think about is shipping costs. They want to get their goods in to turn it into things, to manufacture into things, to sell to other people, to supply to shops, etc. And they're seeing shortages, but they're also seeing increased shipping costs coming around from, you know, goods being transported, for example, from Asia to Europe. And give us an idea about the sort of types of cost increases that the sector's seen.
Well, I've been quite astonished recently. I read, I think it was less than $2,000 to bring a container from the Far East to Northern Europe back in August 2020. It's now heading to around $14,000, and it's gone up by around $6,000 just since April. So I think there's only a limited amount of there's only a limited ability for shippers or traders to carry on absorbing any of those costs. So we're going to start to see price rises soon. And one of the problems we have, I suppose, as policy professionals and policymakers have, is untangling the issues around the volatility around the COVID impacts from all the other impacts that are going on. So we've got I don't want to talk about Brexit too much, as that's another episode. But we're seeing, I think just this week, I couldn't get a Nando's because my local Nando's was shut. They don't have enough chickens, and that's variously reported as because of the pingdemic, a phrase which we're all thoroughly sick of, or they can't get the workers because they've all moved back to Europe.
It's been a bit of a perfect storm, hasn't it?
Yeah.
When you look at it, when you factor in COVID and Brexit and various other economic factors, lack of haulage is one of those things, isn't it? Preventing goods being collected. So dwell times at container ports, but also at ro-ro ports has increased with unaccompanied traffic being or goods being left longer, which is causes pressures on the port estates, etc.
Well, again, not just throw another one in there. It's every port, as Phoebe mentioned, some are having their busiest times ever, whereas others have found the way people live their lives is changing and affecting them. So some of our fishing ports are finding that originally hit pretty hard by restaurants closing down in the lockdown and not being able to sell that seafood into the hospitality sector. Now they're seeing people buying seafood in a totally different way. That's affecting their income as well. So there's almost every port is being affected, or every type of port is being affected in a different way by about 3 or 4 different trends.
I suppose trying to put a positive spin on things, as I usually do, the one good thing is that it shone a light on our sector. It shows the economic importance of the sector. And Phoebes, if we look at other sectors like aviation, for example, they've fared disproportionately, more negatively than we have. Things like passenger movements, etc., which, although very important to certain ports, those ports that handle ferries and cruise ships and also recreational activities. But just give us an idea on sort of what what COVID and everything has done to passenger markets.
Well, I think it's fair to say that volatility has absolutely characterised the last 18 months, and I think we're all beyond making any predictions. Certainly none of us are very keen to do that these days. The Department for Transport recently published the short sea passenger numbers for June 2021, and actually this year has shown a really negative picture, even compared to 2020. So the June 2021 figures show a fall on the 2020 figures, and represent a significant drop compared to 2019 volumes, indicating quite a slow recovery to the pre-pandemic passenger numbers. So the number of short sea passenger numbers, both inward and outward, in June 2021, when we might expect to at least be seeing a few more holiday makers, was 370,000, a fall of 17% compared to June 2020, and actually 79% on June 2019.
I suppose the sort of the positive to that, at least, is that we are going to be moving onwards and upwards with the vaccine, with people managing to live with the virus. And also things like domestic holidays. We've seen sort of, increase of activities of people going around our coastline and rural areas, regional areas, whether they be recreational sailing activities are up, or domestic cruises, which we're now seeing a big growth area. And when I was recently down at the port of Southampton, one of the senior managers there did tell me you can get a great deal on domestic cruises at the moment. So perhaps that's the way forward.
Is that just you because you're big time, Richard? We should be careful what you wish for when it comes to attention from government, as that's not always a good thing. And I think whilst the wider country might recognise shipping and ports as being critical, and we've seen port workers be recognised as key workers, and and a lot of love there. I think the attention that might follow from government once this has all died down, if it ever does, isn't always welcome, and yeah.
Okay, so now we've had a good conversation there, but let's go and talk to someone who's actually doing this and working at the coalface. So I'm delighted to say we're joined by the BPA's chair, and who is also the chief executive of Harwich Haven Authority, Neil Glendinning, OBE, which I'll throw in. And Neil is tasked with keeping the UK's busiest container port open, as well as one or two other operations. So Neil, good to see you. I talked previously about the Ever Given. And I know the Ever Given has been into Harwich and Felixstowe recently. So just give us an overview about what did that do to your operations? What kind of impact has that had on the UK container sector?
At the time, the Ever Given blocking the Suez Canal had a massive impact. And it's a little bit frightening that the canal being blocked for 8 days can have such an impact on global supply chains. But actually here at Harwich, she arrived, she had some defects following the grounding. We took those into account. And to be perfectly honest, we handled her just as any other ship. And there were thousands of people lining the dockside and the seashore here to watch it. But it to all intents and purposes, it was just another 400-metre long ship with a few sandy streaks down the side.
Yeah, I saw some pictures actually of it leaving because I think it's going off for some surveys and inspections to make sure everything's all in order, etc. And it was quite dramatic to see a ship of that size with no containers on it, it was quite an amazing sight actually. But
I was going to say, Richard, you don't often get the opportunity to see them empty, and you get a better appreciation of the actual size of these vessels when they're floating high in the water.
And Neil, what about just generally on we've had quite an interesting 18 months to say the least, but with the pandemic and various things like container surges and etc., just give us an idea about what the pandemic the effect it's had on your operations at Harwich with your VTS and pilotage and other functions that you carry out. How have you managed to support? And then more generally, what's the sort of impact been like on the ports industry in your view?
Okay. The short answer is it's had a huge impact, but don't dwell on that. I think we and all other ports have coped amazingly well with that. It's impacted all UK ports and ports around the world, taking out employees who've become infected themselves or during, hesitate to use the word pingdemic, but if they've been pinged and required to self-isolate, it caused severe labour shortages at times, and with small groups such as pilots and launch crews, that was potentially a serious problem. But we put in place good measures, good protections, and actually we and all the ports around the UK carried on really well. We kept trade flowing, we kept essential goods flowing, and a good news story on that. I think in wider terms, global terms, COVID has impacted the liner schedules, which has caused bunching of ships, which has led to delays. First of all, Yantian had a COVID outbreak, closed down Yantian, more recently Ningbo. This all has a knock-on effect of messing up the schedules. But we cope. There is some delay. I think in the west coast of the US, terrible delays. In Europe, there is some delay, but ports, by and large, ports are managing pretty well.
Are we also seeing, Neil, a bit of like people reacting to these delays and then ordering more or holding more stock, and that in itself is starting to have like a Is that having a circular effect or creating additional problems or not?
I think to a degree it probably adds to the problem. It's a little bit like the toilet roll problem at the beginning of COVID. If people think there's going to be a shortage, or there is actually a shortage, lots of people go out and buy lots of the whatever commodity it is. So I think there have undoubtedly been some shortages, some building materials, timber materials, etc. Essential garden furniture, if there is such a thing. But people will go out and maybe a little bit of panic buying, so that the stocks in industries get low, and those industries try and order more to make up those stocks. So bit of a vicious circle. Absolutely right. Yeah. I think it's a smaller end of that disruption, but it does add to the disruption and congestion.
I mean, Richard's still got 1,000 toilet rolls in his shed from that thing, and my wife has actually just built our garden furniture. She couldn't find anything and had a few days off. So it was having an impact in the Simmons household as well. Neil, we've talked a little bit about shipping costs. What's your view on? We've said that we've seen go up from under $2,000 to nearly $14,000. It's being reported recently. You probably had this as well. I seem to have some journalists and other people from other industries thinking we're now driving around in gold Ferraris because of this, but obviously not the case. But what's your view on the reasons for that, and do you think it's going to be a sustained thing? Are costs going to keep going up, or are they going to level out, or even fall back to sort of more reasonable levels in future?
It's very marked, and the main shipping lines, the main container lines particularly, had a lot of years of not making a lot of money, and sometimes a number of years of losing money on their operations. And it was then, and it still is, a case of supply and demand. I think during COVID, all of the world, including us in the UK, bought lots of stuff, toilet rolls included, mainly from China. Well, when we were in lockdown and severe restrictions on travel, people bought things. This, coupled with the disruption and congestion I just talked about, have resulted in an increased consumer demand just at the same time as a reduced supply of vessels because of the congestion, and containers to ship goods in. As the port congestions continue, vessel operators have concentrated in shipping as many goods as they can to the UK and Europe and US to feed this consumer demand, because it's cargo they get paid for. They don't get paid for shipping empties back. Consequently, they've left a lot of empties behind in their hurry to get back to China and ship more stuff out. The bottom line is, it's not just the shortage of vessels, but it's also a shortage of containers. So the actual cost of shipping is massively increased, as you pointed out now. Absolutely huge. So the lines are currently making up for lost time and making good money. Is it going to sustain? I think, speaking with all the CEOs of the major container lines, they see this continuing into next year, certainly. Can it be sustained? I suspect no. Supply and demand and market forces will even out eventually, but I don't think they'll go back to the previous rate. The lines will have learned that supply and demand is a useful tool.
Do you think retailers, big retailers and big manufacturers, do you think they have their supply chains are resilient enough? Have they been resilient enough? And do you think they'll be examining these just-in-time supply chains in the coming months and years, or will it be back to business as usual after this bump? The whole just-in-time industry, it's worked well. It's worked really well for a lot of years. I think ports have been agile, shipping's been agile. The industries themselves have planned ahead very carefully to the nth degree. But as I just mentioned, that the disruption in Suez, the continuing disruption now is seriously threatening the just-in-time, finely tuned machine. So if I were one of these major consumers of either components or raw materials, I'd be seriously looking at my business resilience plans and whether or not we rely on just in time
or whether we actually build in a buffer of supplies. Now, as you said, the alternative is, do they think about running their own supply chains? That would take massive capital cost investment. And I would suggest there are probably more effective ways of achieving the same result.
And Neil, given various international factors, including COVID and other resilience at play, do you think there could be some examples of nearshoring of supplies in the UK or closer to home?
Yes, possibly. But I think that the whole Chinese... Sorry, I'll expand on that. The whole Chinese economy is massively geared to feeding the consumer demand in the West. And it's a very, very cheap base of supply labour base there. So I think that will continue. It's not just commercially, but politically, China wish that to continue. Is there going to be any nearshoring? I think it will be fairly limited. Things that might push that if relations with China were to get more tense, if either way, either China with the West or the West with China, I suspect there will be not nearshoring, but nearer-shoring. I think a lot of that Chinese manufacturing base would just relocate to other Southeast Asian countries where the labour force is equally cheap. And it's not a Chinese export then. So I think it'll be fairly limited on the nearshoring.
And Neil, it strikes me that a lot of the things we're talking about in this session are very much market-led. So are there any things that we want from policymakers or government, etc.? Have we got any particular asks at the moment for this sector, or is it more a case of just the freight sector will and the shipping industry will sort and level these issues in the coming months and years?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Richard. I think what I would ask is, and it's probably an impossible ask, that government, certainly UK government and European and international government, don't let the political questions get in the way too much of trade. At the end of the day, I really believe that ports and business will find a way, whatever. But Brexit's presented its own hurdles that the COVID has, and any post-Brexit trade agreements that might come out of this. It's about working with the industries to get a pragmatic. The big ask is listen to us, work with industry, and we can iron out a lot of the problems that might be built into new deals that don't need to be. So the biggest ask is listen to us, listen to the people at the coalface that are doing this day in, day out, and I think we get a better result.
Well, thanks very much for that, and thanks also on behalf of the country for keeping us supplied, Neil, for all your teams and everything. So until the next time, thanks, Neil.
Thanks very much, Richard. Take care.
Well, you've heard the views from the BPA, but what about an external perspective? We've asked Susan Oatway, who's the chair of the Institute of Chartered Shipbrokers, to share her views.
So the specific problem within the UK is obviously centred around haulage. And it's easy to say that the UK industry should train its own drivers, but it's not just about wages. The job needs to be made more attractive by improving conditions. However, UK haulage is made up of a large number of individual companies. The thought that each of these individual companies could somehow build a large number of individual facilities all over the UK to service their trucks and drivers is not practical. This really needs to be the responsibility of highways and council agencies to provide facilities to suit the traffic volumes that travel on their roads. Hauliers would pay for secure, comfortable areas, and it would potentially open the job to female drivers, doubling, possibly, the supply. But contrarily, the last safe area between Cambridge and Felixstowe is closing shortly, leaving only laybys. As it stands, the highways are extremely insecure and unsafe for cargoes standing overnight. You shouldn't expose anyone to that, let alone females. You also need to address the problems at the ports. They are reaching capacity. It's a toxic combination of low port productivity and shipping lines not willing to wait for loading empty units, or even the ports not willing to spend the time on those empty units. That means they run out of space to operate efficiently. Felixstowe has recently advised it will shortly refuse to accept empty containers from major carriers. That means empty units have to be returned away from Felixstowe, leading to further reduction in haulage capacity as trucks are pulled out of position. There's a lot of talk about the high wage economy and the UK over-reliance on cheap labour. But you have to remember, if you drive up haulage costs, then you drive up the costs of everything. And this must proportionally affect lower price cargoes, such as food, more than it will higher value cargo. Those on lower earnings spend more proportionally on food than those on higher wages. There's a potential political price to letting the market rip. What can the government do? Well, obviously substantially increase the number of EU HGV driver visas and taper them down over a number of years, not weeks. A long-term plan is needed. You need to build road infrastructure to surface trucks and their drivers to improve conditions and make the job more attractive. Again, it's not just about the wages. And they need to process that large number of HGV applications that are reportedly being held by the DVLA. An increase in the number of drivers and vehicles would allow the UK ports to clear their import cargo more quickly and give them space to breathe. That would improve productivity and allow empties to be loaded in a reasonable time, further improving the situation. Globally, we need more investments in port infrastructure and in hinterland transport links. This is the responsibility of both port landlords as well as governments. We need better communication between ports, ship owners, truckers and importers and exporters to manage the crisis and mitigate the worst disruptions. We need to encourage behaviour change, whereby exporters, importers help truckers or ship owners become more efficient, and whereby ship owners help ports become more efficient, in return for priority access to scarce assets. In general, we need policies to raise the level of cooperation between all stakeholders, because no single party can solve the global supply chain problems. The links between ports and importers and exporters in particular are not close enough.
Susan Oatway from the Institute of Chartered Shipbrokers giving us her perspective. Right, so we've heard quite a lot about containers today and particularly deep sea traffic, Asia, Europe, etc. But of course, a lot of our goods comes from the near continent and from closer to home. And a lot of that is food, and I think the numbers are we import almost half of the food that we consume in the UK, and supply chain issues, whilst they might have impacts on garden furniture, as Neil mentioned, and other sort of things that we could probably manage without. As soon as you get shortages of food, that's a different issue, particularly. So, I just wondered, Mark, if what have you seen in the last 18 months about our supply chains with Europe, ferry lines, etc., and the impacts of COVID on them, and what's that done? And we've managed, I think. I mean, I've put on weight during the lockdown, so obviously it hasn't been that bad.
Well, yeah, this is one of those things I see on Twitter. People saying that they can't, the shelves are empty in their shops, and I've not personally seen that. So I don't know if there's different impacts in different places. I live in London, and it seems to have been okay where I am. But yes, well, I think we've coped okay. It's people I've spoken to have found it really difficult to disentangle the impacts of COVID and Brexit, whether that be labour impacts or border impacts. And of course, we haven't felt the full impact of Brexit yet. It's because the import controls haven't fully come in, or the checks haven't come in fully yet, and we'll be seeing that in January or possibly later next year. So it's still going on. Brexit already feels to me like a historical incident, some traumatic event of years of arguing and division years ago, something that happened way in the past. But of course, we're still right in the middle of it in many respects. So. Myriad impacts, and I think we'll still be chewing over this in about 20 years, discussing what the impacts were.
It's all about the statistics, somewhat, without going into the sort of actual, which port did this and that, etc. last year. I know we've had the sort of annual figures from Department for Transport on the annual numbers for 2020. How's the sector doing? It wasn't a great year last year, obviously, and this year doesn't look like it started off particularly well. But I assume as we come out of lockdowns and we get used to Brexit, etc., that things will return to whatever that norm is.
Yeah, I was talking to someone the other day who was telling me that food is the cheapest in this country it's ever been. So it's a very small percentage of our income, our personal incomes. So I think it's something, post-war it used to be something like a third of what we would spend would be on food, whereas now it's something like 10%. So it is. I do wonder if that will change. Perhaps do we pay enough for our food? No one wants to pay more, but I wonder whether not just the impacts of new trade barriers, but all of the other things that we've been discussing today might mean that food just necessarily costs more, and there's other impact as well from climate change. All these things are going to have put pressure on the cost of food, not just shipping. So.
Yes, it's interesting actually thinking about when we had the results of the EU referendum. You remember there was a bit of a few sort of changes in currency markets, and I recall actually a kind of bigger impact was when the pound slid down against the euro substantially and other currencies, and when we're buying in food from say Europe, etc., it's coming in and we're paying more for it. But I think at the moment the pound is certainly stable and is driving up in value against things like the Aussie dollar, the US dollar slightly. And I suppose that helps us keep these costs under control. But it's a very interesting area, isn't it, about how much income we have to spend on food. And I think with the other thing with the pandemic, we've all realised as a fundamental, how important it is, whether it's takeaways as such I indulged in for the last 18 months quite frequently, or indeed cooking at home. So
I was going to say, who do we need to get a trade deal with to get Nando's open again? I don't know, get Liz Truss out there.
I think they come
right
from
now.
Thailand, Nando's chickens.
Really?
Yeah.
Do they really? Oh well, that's long afield, isn't it?
It's a long trip.
So it's a bit different from the sort of poultry breadbasket of the eastern regions of the UK. So. What about Phoebe? What about statistics then? And how are numbers looking at the ports? Hasn't been a particularly healthy last 18 months, but is there any green shoots, signs of recovery yet?
Well, the issue with that we often find when talking about trade statistics is actually the delay it takes to get them. So when we had quarter 1 2021 stats, we only received them in June, and actually this was the first time as a whole we were able to see the aggregate impact of Brexit on port volumes. But unfortunately, due to the timing of the Brexit deadline falling at the same time as the third national lockdown, it is challenging, as Mark referenced earlier, to truly separate their impact and draw firm conclusions about which had a more harmful impact on trade in the first quarter. Total trade in goods with EU countries decreased 23.1%, and non-EU countries decreased only by 0.8%. So it clearly is quite a big Brexit impact when comparing quarter 1 2020 with Q1 2018, and exports to Ireland saw the greatest proportional fall of the UK's top exporting partners after the EU transition period. So it is fair to attribute a significant proportion of this disruption to Brexit.
It's probably quite interesting to see how much of that is sort of short-term or long-term lasting, isn't it? But we'll come to that in a separate session of Brexit.
Phoebe, do you remember, I think it might have been quite soon after you started, I think DFT, the Department for Transport, were talking about or it might have been the Office for National Statistics. This is a really nerdy point. We're talking about doing sort of real-time statistics, or getting trade stats out there much quicker than they do now. Was that just one of those things that just got left behind by the pandemic and other things, and Brexit and everything else that government have been distracted by, or did anything ever come of that? Because that strikes me as something that might have been quite useful to have over the last 18 months.
Especially answering journalist inquiries.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
The DFT stats are our most important data source, 100%. But those quick time figures are generally quite useful, but just don't offer us such an expansive view of the picture of trade.
Does anyone ever compare the actual backward-facing stats, what actually happened, to what people said was going to happen, and forecasts and government things like that? Does anyone ever go back and look how accurate government forecasting and modelling is?
No, because I think that would prove that somebody got it wrong. I think they do those retrospective things, but the one thing we know about forecasts is they're always going to be wrong. So, and we've got a forecasting tool at the moment the Department for Transport has that it can update regularly. But I think that's one for us to discuss with government officials to see when the next update is made available. Well, with Brexit and COVID still looming large over the industry, the issue of supply chain resilience is likely to be with us for quite some time. But that's all we have time for today on this session. My thanks to our guests for joining us to discuss this topic, and also my colleagues Phoebe and Mark for their views. And join us again next time for the BPA Portscast.